skip lunch, I suggest we sit down and we harvest. There was a lot of ideas, I thought. Right? So where can we start? Who wants to start? April. We have a mic?
So I think we had a very dynamic group, and I'd ask the group, as I mentioned, a few things to add, anything they want. So we started out, we were the yellow group. You can see Joanna's still in there. And we started out with going over the questions. And the first question was, what are the requirements for a nucleus to inspire other people? So we spent a lot of time on that question. And we began by saying it's really important to start with yourself and your own spiritual growth in order to help other people. And how do you do that? And so we spent some time talking about becoming more conscious of our own issues and healing ourselves as we reach out to other people. And at the same time, we saw this need to balance out our own personality or sort of lower nature with our higher self. And we had some really good metaphors, analogies, and stories for getting to this. And one of them was a nice little story from the Buddha. A man once told Buddha, I want happiness. And he said, first remove the I, that's ego. Then remove the want, that's desire. And now you're left with happiness. So I thought it was a really great, it's kind of a nice epitome of our conversation, but it's not so easy to deal with the ego. And with finding a balance between using the ego in a constructive and creative way, and at the same time opening oneself up to our higher nature and how we do that as we reach out to help others. So then we also talked about the other side of that question, which is how can we work towards being inspired to help others. And then we talked about inspiration, creativity, and what is that about. We mentioned a little story about this potter who, back in the 60s, he ran a coffee house and he was a potter. And when he would make his pots, people would watch him make his pots, and just by the virtue of his creativity and his love for what he was doing, it would inspire creativity in others. So we talked about how we are inspired and we get inspired by others. Talked about the muses. And we also mentioned the idea of being inspired by doing things for other people. So as you're working on whatever you love, you're doing it for other people, it's a source of inspiration because you're not concentrating on yourself. You're concentrating on your motive. It becomes your motive, and it opens you up to be more creative because you're less concentrated on yourself. You're doing it for yourself. Self-knowledge, whatever. But if you're doing it for others, then sometimes it has that inspirational quality to it. So then, let's see. We worked on the second question a little bit, which was a universal brotherhood or the universal brotherhood. And then an important comment that was made is that we need to draw a wider circle to be inclusive of people. And then we also talked about a model for how do we do that with people that are, for us, the other, that maybe represent in us what we don't like in ourselves. So we talked about an example of that was town hall meetings, and I use the example of Bernie Sanders, who I saw do an absolutely stupendously creative job in a town hall of connecting with all the people who voted for Trump, who were in pain and suffering, losing their jobs, having a hard life, having great difficulty. And what he did first is connect with them. And he talked about, he asked them what their pain was. He asked them their questions about why they were upset, what was going on, and hated the government and everything else. And they told him. And once he connected with them, he very carefully, as they brought up misinformation, very carefully corrected them with facts. But he couldn't have done it if he didn't empathize with their suffering first. So we really talked about how we could do that to enlarge in our circle. How can we reach people by empathizing with their own pain and then developing the skillful means to be wise enough to deal with where they are right now and what they need, given our own growth and our own self-development. So that was a very interesting conversation. And let's see, you had that great quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. Let's see if I can find it. Can you say it? Stand up.
We spoke about the fact that if you want to inspire others, you need to appeal to their heart.
Yeah.
And
yes,
Eleanor Roosevelt said that if you want to handle yourself, use your head. But if you want to handle others, use your heart.
So I just would like to ask if anybody wants to add anything from the group. All right.
Excellent, thank you. And there's going to be a Zen version later on.
Oh,
April already promised me, so
I have a Zen version.
Looking forward to that. Thank you.
I have a Zen version.
Over here? No?
Well, we were in the green room. We had a very lively discussion. We went through, of course, the three different questions. And starting with the first one about how does the nucleus inspire us, I think we finally came to a conclusion that we need to start with a higher view, a higher vision. And part of that comes from our understanding as Theosophists that there is this hierarchy of vehicles that we are each, that the universe is, from physical up through the mental and emotional to the spiritual. So the example was given of trying to find your way out of a labyrinth. It always helps, of course, if you have a view from above to see the labyrinth or a map. And yet, we also have to still find our way out physically, and people help us a lot with that. So with teamwork and exploring together, we can, in a sense, use that nucleus, that coming together for everyone's progress. The other question came from discussing the approach that we take. So that looking at a problem from the higher level is great, and we call that impersonality sometimes. But for some of us, that meant that it was not connecting with people personally or caring about them or reaching out or understanding them. So it was interesting that one of our contributors said, instead of using impersonality, sometimes we say above personality, taking the higher road and connecting on that level, which is really the level that gets us out of our individual differences in many cases. And that brought us to the second question, which was...
Can I ask something about that?
Yeah.
Because April was just talking about giving an example of that, how you have to connect maybe sometimes on a more personal level first. So how do you see that? Or what was the conclusion in your group? Do we go immediately to the above personal level, or how does that work?
I think they work together. I think you don't understand the higher lessons until you act them out and apply them on a one-to-one basis. So a lot of people in our group said we start with people around us, with our family. One lady shared that she was making up and asking forgiveness for a mistake 15 years ago with a former spouse. So our own families, our friends, our neighbors is where we really meet and share and change the world. But we do that on the basis of these higher principles and understandings, so we're not stuck at the level of people simply disagreeing and feeling that their disagreements are so important.
So we start with the family, and the town hall is somewhere later on. All right, thank you.
So let's see, we were back to the second one, which was the idea of universal brotherhood or not universal. And we thought of a lot of these groups which have done some great work, but which still hold themselves out as being very special, or the elect, or the elite, or whatever it might be. And so we thought about, can we always serve humanity and how we do that? And many of us felt that we do that actually through smaller groups that are focused, that have a common shared vision and philosophy like ITC. And we're not really able to completely share that with humanity. We do it little by little, group by group. And so on the idea was that even if you're a small group, you have a universal vision. You are not feeling like you're the special ones, like you're, so many groups hold themselves out as being special or better, that if you're not in this group, you're not even saved, that you may go to hell and perdition, right? That's the opposite of the Theosophic view, we thought. And part of that is not judging. And one example came up that a guru told one of our contributors. She didn't want to be judging people because it was just automatic. Instantly when she saw people, she was judging them by their looks, attitudes, whatever. The guru said, remember this, when you're about to judge, you don't have enough information. And she realized that when she actually got to know people and held back on her judgments, that suddenly compassion was natural because she could understand where they came from. And really, everyone has that beautiful higher self that is infinite, potential. So we moved from there to the third question, which was the organizations. What can we do, for example, in the three major Theosophic organizations here? And everyone agreed that we have to keep our message fresh and put it in modern language without necessarily in any way detracting from the original and its purity. However, we also looked at the example of the previous Theosophical movement, which was the Freemasonry, and it was shared that in Holland there was a lot of suspicion about Freemasons because they're so secret. And yet in America, in the last 20 years, the Freemasons have opened their temples to public tours. They have opened their books, which were completely secret until 1977, to the public and allowed them to be read and sold, like Morals and Dogma. And she said for her, that changed her vision of that organization and took away some of the feelings of suspicion or concern. So the idea of Theosophy, reaching out to the world, engaging the world more, but also at the same time on an individual basis, each of us trying to elevate our own manas to the level through working with others and trying to help them as we help ourselves. Every person is a student and a teacher. I think that summarizes it.
I don't know what color we were. I was a newcomer, but... But we focused on the second question, and we're intending to go on to the third, but didn't make it because we got diverted into a discussion of whether the table has consciousness and knowledge. And Jean came in and gave us some instruction. But it remains an open question. But most of our discussion focused on the difference between universal brotherhood and brotherhood that isn't so universal. And the perspective was that universal brotherhood includes all manifestation, all sentient beings, and that of course includes all human beings, and is characterized by abstraction, boundlessness, and the working of compassion, where we are working for the interests of all living beings. We have an interest in the development of all living beings, including an interest in their future lives. And universal brotherhood requires acts for the sake of universal principles. It also includes recognizing that each person is a ray of divine wisdom, and that if one is injured, all is injured, knowing that we are all spiritual beings. And also, universal brotherhood is inclusive, no one's excluded, and that one of the best expressions of universal brotherhood is universal ethics, and that gives us the guidelines to applying universal principles. By contrast, brotherhood without universality is exclusive. It has questionable motivations. It may produce conflict, tribalism. The doctrine of America First was mentioned, and that it really is not particularly constructive. We should remember where all is one, there is oneness. But then we reversed our attention and started thinking about the universal brotherhood that is learned in small circles, that the distinction is not a matter of numbers, that starting in the family and moving on to education, communities, various kinds of associations that help us become ethical and social beings, that they can be centers of universal brotherhood. We learn very healthy lessons in those smaller circles, that they're stepping stones to a larger vision and a larger participation in human affairs and in our actions in regard to all of nature. So we have to start, we do start with those stepping stones, so we shouldn't be too hard on the limitedness of scope that we find in small groups or the family or perhaps even the tribe. It's a question of attitude and motivation. And we also said, well, what about the instruction of HBB that we start with a nucleus of universal brotherhood? Certainly we don't want to see that as a negative context or a negative aim to develop a nucleus of universal brotherhood just because it involves smaller groups of people. And we imported Johannes 3 points that in a nucleus of universal brotherhood, there's no criticizing or condemning. There's an aim of universal doctrines of beliefs, and that there's a bonding between the members of that brotherhood or that nucleus. And we talked quite a bit. We made several references to Kim Miller's talk about what is characteristic of a nucleus and how it includes an outreach to the larger world. We also recognize that with a nucleus, you have perhaps a center of active participation, and that is a distinction. If you think about the goal of universal brotherhood and 7.4 billion people on Earth, not all are at this point in evolution actually participating in the promotion and understanding and use of universal brotherhood and its principles. So there's a lot of work to do. Yes, that universal ethics provides an interface between different desires of different people. But that's why you need the ethics to create these bonds. I think that...
Carolyn, can I ask you something about that? How does the interface work with the ethics then? How does that...
For instance, we teach children, and we maybe don't do so effectively enough with adults, the need to share. So I want this, I want a nice big house, and I want to conserve the environment. So what are we going to do about that? Are we going to fight over it, or are we going to find a process whereby we would learn to share and each reduce or reshape their desire so that it is more in harmony with some sense of shared good, shared value.
So the ethics is more or less shapes the interface.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting thought.
It's a corrective.
Okay, so this is the harvest of the orange nucleus of universal brotherhood. And I say that because one of our initial topics of thought was, is there one nucleus or many nucleus? Is it a nucleus of universal brotherhood or the nucleus of universal brotherhood? So this led to consideration that there may not only be many nuclei on different aspects of this physical plane, but that the nucleus can have different meanings on various planes. So when we speak of something, what is the function of the nucleus, we really need to clarify what nucleus we're talking about. Are we talking about that eternal nucleus? Are we talking about the inner nucleus? Are we talking about the nucleus of our little conference table that we had, or as an individual? So one of the functions of the nucleus of universal brotherhood is there is this eternal nucleus, but not everybody is aware of it. So one of the functions of the nucleus of universal brotherhood as it manifests is to make people aware that there is this nucleus and they are part of it. And one of the ways of doing that is through the function of, as was brought out this morning, bringing forth a continent of thought in the world. Now, what happens when a continent rises in the world? Well, another continent is subsided or is flooded away. So there cannot be a rising of a continent of thought without a submersion of something different. So this brought us to the life of Thomas Paine and his important contributions and his personal sufferings. And we thought it was a good example about how an individual, in being brotherly, does not have to condemn persons, but can still be critical and discerning of ideas and speak up for what is right and correct misconceptions. And we thought, since there is no stamp for Thomas Paine, and there is no medal for Thomas Paine, and he seems to be ignored, that perhaps in our Philadelphia Declaration, we could use some certain catchphrases that give homage to his importance to us, such as common sense, the age of reason, and the rights of man, or humanity, if you will. So we looked at the consideration, what are the prerequisites for a nucleus of universal brotherhood? Well, any nucleus, and if we speak of the atomic nucleus, but any nucleus to be an attractive or a force or an influencing force has to cohere. It has to stick together. And so this brings us to the idea to define what is the similarity of aim, purpose, and principles or teachings that hold us together. And in defining those and promulgating those, the importance came through that we want to be able to simplify the teachings without diluting them. And so there was discussion on what is the difference between simplifying and diluting something. Well, when you dilute something, as was brought out in homeopathy, you add more and more and more water until you can't even see the substance. It's so watered down that it can't be distinguished from anything else. But to simplify it, like a particle of gold, you remove all the dross, the dirt, the other elements, and so in simplifying something, you can see its essence, its value for what it really is, which is completely different from diluting something. So in one of the other prerequisites for a nucleus in order to be effective in the world is we have to be open and listen to others and not put up walls of preconception. The idea of the guardian wall came up. And one of the ideas was, well, the guardian wall seems too passive. It's too protective. And we were reminded it just protects. What does it do to get involved? Just protecting, defending us. And we were reminded of the statement from the voice of the silence that the guardian wall is cemented together by the blood of the masters and adepts. Well, you don't get involved with something with your blood unless you get your hands dirty and you're willing to work. So the idea was that this guardian wall is not a passive but a very active and involved involvement in the community. The importance of having the experiences, whether they're of suffering or in family, these experiences become valuable tools for illuminating the teachings. Now, how can an organization, the Theosophical Nucleus or association or organization, better become an instrument for the expression of divine wisdom? And the idea was that every organization, theosophical or otherwise, has its principles, its bylaws, its declaration, by what is the guiding document for how they're going to behave, how they're going to interact with others in the world, what's their purpose. So we need to be students of the philosophy to understand what is divine wisdom so we can translate it into words that become the basis and the guiding principles of the theosophical organization or an organization such as ITC. Because the ideas we have are magnetic and attract. The heart qualities that we have of providing security, of friendship, of acceptance are as attractive to others and as influential as the ideas of Theosophy. Then for this final point, and this one seemed to really excite the imagination of the group and led to many interesting points, and we'll just throw this out for you to consider. We know that the ITC is an organization, but here's the question. Is it healing to consider ITC as an idea and not an organization? So we'll leave you with that food for thought.
Thank you. We have one more, I think. Right? We have five. Yeah. Olga, and maybe Olga, maybe I can ask you to. Could you shortly reflect on what you just heard? Because it took us some time to. Could you repeat one more time what you just said?
What I just said. I mean, the last question. Okay. This is an encore presentation of the last. The last question was, is it healing to think of ITC as an idea and not an organization?
Thank you very much. Did you hear it?
Yes, I hear. And you mean idea or ideal? Idea. So is it healing to think about ITC as an idea rather than organization? That's a tough one, I have to admit. Well, honestly, what is ITC? It is a conference, right, where we all get together. And if we think about it, what is behind it? Why? What is that driving force that makes us come together and be here, participate in these meetings, in this study, to share our ideas with each other? There is something that is behind it within each one of us. So perhaps if we look at it from that standpoint, it can be an idea that we carry with us, with our heart, every time we come here.
Thank you. And let's move to your group.
So, the first question was, what are the requirements for a nucleus to inspire people? Our ideas. A nucleus needs to be active and connected through harmonious work together with deep sense of brotherliness among co-students, fellow Theosophists. By working on ourselves, we help humanity and vice versa, because we are interconnected. Also, self-study needs to be practiced not only individually, but as a self-study as an organization. By seeing goodness in others, we inspire them to see that goodness within themselves. We trust in that goodness within others. Second question was, what might be the difference between a universal brotherhood and brotherhood that isn't universal? We have actually only one idea. Universal brotherhood is a non-sectarian brotherhood that includes all. And the third question was, how can theosophical organizations best serve the work of or be an optimal instrument in the world for divine wisdom? And that we transformed into another question. We've seen that there's a lack of personal interaction among people nowadays. And the comment was that everybody is looking in the screens of their phones, tablets, etc., TV. How can we apply principle of homeopathy, heal alike with alike, to be an optimal instrument in the world for divine wisdom?
Thank you very much. All right.
Well, thank you all very much. We're running a little bit behind on the day, but